Recruiting for leadership roles is in many ways easier than recruiting for entry-level positions. Over time, an individual has had an opportunity to build up a track record for good or bad, and pattern have an opportunity to establish themselves. The other great thing is you can see where the person has worked over the years, how long they stayed there, how progressive their career has been in terms of growth, and so on. In other words, there are more clues regarding how successful a potential candidate may or may not be based on their career experiences. Think about recruiting graduates. Comparatively speaking, they don't have any work experience or certainly very little to speak of. So you're faced with looking at academics, extracurricular activities, achievements outside of the classroom, and indicators that may predict success but ultimately don't give any guarantees. We need a better system that can accurately predict outcomes, as anyone can cheat in an interview. Interviewers themselves are subject to such strong bias that the answers given are often assessed based on preconceived notions by the interviewer about that person's suitability. There's no getting away from the fact that people will prepare for interviews, rehearse answers, objectively review the resume, and finesse their stories about what went right and wrong. Candidates should be doing this. Why wouldn't they? However, the process of interviewing is not an exact science with predictable outcomes. So when we don't have a perfect way, we have to identify the best way possible, given the inherent limitations of interviewing. So why are all companies bad at interviewing? Well, we're starting here with the recognition that no interview process is going to be perfect. Lies will be told, biased judgments will be made, answers will be rehearsed, and the interviewer is likely to go off in tangents that will lead to judgments being made that have nothing to do with how well the candidate can do the job. Let's look at some of these issues in more depth before going on to identify the solutions outlined in the remaining sections. Just asking a series of unrelated questions does not make someone an interviewer. The structured behavioural competency interview is where this is often most apparent. An interviewer has a checklist of questions and asks a series of questions that they may not have been in a position to evaluate, given how misleading and patchy competency interviews are in the first place. Interviewers no doubt learn their interview skills from the interviews they've been on in the past, rather than from any meaningful or useful structured interview training. Candidates only have one story. Everything that the interviewer needs to know about the candidate is contained in their story. What makes the difference is how much of the stories the interviewer is able to extract and analyse in a meaningful way. There's no need for these difficult trick question interviews. The candidate's story will be more honest and fluid if the interviewer directs the line of questioning to flow between each stage of the candidate's life. Of course, people can still lie, however, you can minimise the candidate's opportunities to lie. You can start by not asking completely abstract questions and instead be very specific in leading them through their career, getting deep into the detail about the key moments in their life and career. A candidate should never ever fail an interview. Perhaps they may not qualify for the job, but they shouldn't be failing the interview itself. And by failing an interview, I mean they crumble under the pressure of the interview and get stuck. That won't happen if they're made to feel comfortable in the interview and you're actually asking them about things that they know about, which is their life and their career. If you're all over the place asking them to recall unmemorable events at random, as in the case of many competency interviews, they're going to make mistakes. I recall many amazing candidates with great careers completely fail an interview because the interviewer was terrible. Do you recall a time when you had a terrible interviewer and you walked away feeling like your background wasn't well represented in the interview? That's usually not your fault. In The Source of Truth, written in the Harvard Business Review, it states the first problem with feedback is that humans are unreliable raters of other humans. Over the past 40 years, psychometricians have shown in study after study that people don't have the objectivity to hold in their heads a stable definition of an abstract quality such as business acumen or assertiveness, and then accurately evaluate someone else on it. Our evaluations are deeply coloured by our own understanding of what we're rating others on, our own sense of what good looks like for a particular competency, our harshness or leniency as raters, and our own inherent and unconscious biases. According to HBR, this phenomenon is called the idiosyncratic rater effect, and it's large. More than half of your rating of someone else reflects your characteristics, not theirs. And it's resilient. No training can lessen it. In other words, the research shows that feedback is more distortion than truth. And clearly this is some worrying research. We are apparently incapable of holding shared definitions of competencies or being able to evaluate people based on these competencies. Forget competencies for a moment. We can't even agree on what A, B, and C represent when it comes to performance. You may be aware of companies talking about A, B, and C players. Some even use these references as part of an interview process. How do we know the interviewer and candidate are even speaking about the same thing? I've never bought into the A, B, C player narrative, as there are too many moving targets for it to hold any value. Are they universally classified, or is it within a company relative to their peers? If it's relative to their peers, what are the criteria? Does it change when more A or C players are added because the median will definitely change? Look at the academic world. Being an A player in a mid-tier university won't even make you a C player in an Ivy League school. They at least have SAT scores to underpin some assumptions. In the corporate world though, how are we classifying these? Besides, in a company, how does a B player know they've hired a C player? Isn't it part of the job of a leader and manager to develop people, and therefore it's okay that they hire C players? Aren't grads technically C players compared to those with 2 years' experience until they're trained up? If a B player only hired C players, wouldn't their resulting performance be a C and therefore not make them a B player? Does a B player technical manager only hire C player coders? Will they really be that silly if they're looking to climb the ladder? I feel like the only utility for this type of narrative is in explaining in part why poor leaders manage to climb the career ladder in the first place. I don't think it should be used as any kind of measurable part of an interview. Let's say I work in a global bank. I may be an A-player individual contributor who gets my first promotion as a reward for being an A-player. Maybe I'm a great computer engineer or a great salesperson, for example. As a new manager of 5 people, I may be a B or a C player, as I haven't yet developed the experience, but I have a team made up of 2 A players, 2 B players, and 1 C, which is enough for me to look like a competent manager. Therefore, I'm promoted again a year later, even though I'm not an A player manager. Now I'm really out of my depth and I'm a C player leader, but I have a team of ambitious people, mostly made up of A's and B's, so I keep my job and may even get promoted again. As a C player leader, I'm going to keep hiring A's and B's so I'm not found out. I'm not going to hire C's, as then I have a team of terrible people that expose my incompetence. Why would I do that? If it's because I'm insecure and incompetent, then the best way to hide that is to have a better team, not a worse one. This is why I don't believe this B players hire C players to look good narrative. C player managers can get into management by being an A player individual contributor, but cannot grow without a team that is more competent than they are. The degree of complexity in unwrapping this narrative renders its application in interviews useless, in my opinion. Let's get back to the competencies. If the interviewer is asking a candidate about a specific competency, that interviewer has to have their own interpretation of what that competency is. The candidate will also have their interpretation of what the competency is, and do we therefore just have to hope they're speaking about the same thing? We may never reach common ground in understanding the interpretations of what certain competencies are. But what we can do is reduce the error caused by the idiosyncratic rater effect. For example, instead of asking the candidate about specific competencies directly, the interviewer can observe the competencies in the process of asking very focused and detailed questions about each role. I'll share more on this in part 4, but this way you only have one interpretation of what these competencies are, the interviewer's interpretation. In this proposed method, the candidate is merely talking about their work experience in detail, closely directed by the skilled interviewer, with no mention of competencies themselves, yet in their stories, the competencies will be quite apparent. For example, the candidate may tell several different stories that demonstrate an unusually high level of determination. The interviewer can make this observation without asking a question like, Give me an example of a time when you demonstrated your determination to finish a task. Secondly, by assessing fewer competencies, not so few that we're missing chunks of valuable data, but instead of 50 in the Bremnes method, we have 4 meta traits and a further 12 facets. Not all competencies are going to be relevant at all times, and by condensing many into a few that are more easily understood and interpreted, we can further reduce the potential for human error. More importantly, we're not negatively skewing the results with competencies that are not significant decision influencers. Finally, in having 2 or more people interview and ask similar questions, we may not necessarily reduce human error, but we will at least have different relatable viewpoints to combine and aggregate. However, we can't have everything. As unique individuals, we still have to be able to exercise a right to an opinion. Opinions are shaped by individual life experiences, culture, and many other things, but we have to start somewhere. We can't just leave our opinions to the objectivity of so-called perfect questions, as would be the case if Amazon's Alexa were the interviewer. This is why the development of AI in interviewing is concerning to me. Not all of it, but the parts that are pitched as a solution to the bias problem in recruiting are frankly alarming. We need to know who the diversity candidates are in order to make sure they're being hired. Technology that takes out references to gender and race on resumes, for example, is not doing diversity candidates any good for reasons I'll explore in greater detail in the science section. The next problem with the interviewer is they haven't been properly trained to interview, or the training they've received has been in an interview method which is not fit for purpose. I've seen it happen so many times over the years when hearing feedback from candidates. Often I'll hear about a ridiculous question that's been asked that could not possibly have provided the interviewer anything meaningful or useful in terms of feedback. Or even worse, I'll have 3 different candidates all interview with the same person, and when I ask what questions they were asked, they all give me completely different answers. How can one interviewer make an informed judgment on a candidate if they're using different questions to assess each candidate's suitability for a given role? It's not possible. There was a really interesting study done by Richard Duvall and his colleagues in 1987 called Medical School Performance of Initially Rejected Students. This came about as Texas legislators tried to figure out a way to deal with the shortage of physicians. Their solution was to increase admissions to medical school by 50 people, beyond the initial 150 that were selected. That meant the 50 people came from a pool of potential students who hadn't previously made the grade. Furthermore, only 7 of the 50 had even had an offer from another school. So it's fair to assume Texas Medical School was not the only rejection some of these candidates initially received. 2 incredible discoveries came from this study. Firstly, the difference in the eventual pass rate between those who were initially rejected and those who got on the first time was 0. What does that tell us? The interview process that each candidate went through, where they were quizzed on factors outside of their academic qualifications, was completely useless as a predictor of success. The medical school could have, in theory, gotten the same results if they just made it a lottery for any students who met certain academic criteria. The second interesting finding from the study was, it serves in most schools as an effective recruiting device. Students at UTMSH were surveyed to determine what influenced them to select a particular school. A majority stated that the positive effect of the interviewer was of major importance in their decision. Yes, this was a study done in the 80s with medical students as the subjects, but it accurately conveys that bias happens on both sides of the interview, and this is very important. The interviewer is also being judged by the candidate. How impressive are they? How convincing are they? How well do they know the company? How tough and relevant are their interview questions? You have to make sure the interviewer representing the company does so with similar preparation as the candidate must undertake in getting ready for an interview. The other issue with the interviewer is they're not prepared to be interviewed themselves. It is unlikely that the candidate will interview them, but the interviewer needs to be fully prepared not only to answer the questions, but also to sell the company and the opportunity. Whatever part of the organisation you currently work in, if you or your colleagues cannot answer the following questions with succinct and consistent answers known throughout the company, how can you expect to land the star candidates? How are the company values visible at different levels of the organisation? What am I likely to get in a career here that I can't get at your best competitor? How would you describe the company culture? Why did you join the company and why are you still here? What frustrates people most about working here and what's been done about it? Where would you want to work if it weren't here and why? I will often ask these questions to a client that I'm recruiting for. The thought process that an interviewer has to go through to answer these questions forces them to think more broadly and deeply, which in turn prepares them for so many other related questions that may come up. Not only that, but they're then equipped to articulate what is great about the company. Let's explore each of these 6 questions in more detail. How are the company values visible at different levels of the organisation? This question assumes that the interviewer knows what the values are in the first place. In my experience, it is likely they don't, at least not without checking their company website. If the values listed don't make sense or don't accurately reflect who the company is, this is a great place to start to work on this with your colleagues. More and more in today's workplace, people value purpose and want to know they're working towards one. Values are no longer the short list of funky words that the marketing team dreamed up to fill out space on your company's website. This is an integral part of attracting great talent. Know your values and learn how they manifest in each area of the company. What am I likely to get in a career here that I can't get at your best competitor? When I ask this, I usually get terrible answers. Typically, the answer will end up being a list of things that aren't even unique to this company. We're not looking here for, well, we have great benefits and we have a great pension plan. What really makes you unique as an employer? You may well be working on some of the most interesting solutions to problems in your industry, but so are your 2 best competitors. What else is it that's unique that candidates can't find elsewhere? These are things that need to be thought through long and hard, as if you can't articulate them, there may not be any, and if there's nothing unique, how can you expect people to join? Why do they join? Maybe it's the culture. Well, there you go. Culture is arguably unique in any company. It has to be. The unique combination of people you have working in your company will never exist anywhere else. So it's best to think hard about this, and if culture is the only thing you can come up with, ask yourself this. What are people likely to get in my top competitors that we can't offer them here? If you don't know what your top competitors offer, why not? Knowing what your competitors can offer that you currently aren't is a great starting point to start to level the playing field and make your company more competitive. And don't wait to rely on HR to come up with the answers. They are very busy dealing with all of the other many things you've asked them to do very cheaply, like recruiting, for example. Sure, get HR involved, but also be proactive in working with the rest of your leadership team. Get them to find out. Get their teams to find out by joining groups on LinkedIn, chatting to their ex-colleagues, and doing whatever they can to identify this information. How would you describe the company culture? When I ask this question, I often get very dull and predictable answers. If someone is describing something in a dull and predictable way, you can be sure it's not something that's going to get a candidate excited. I'm sure your culture is dynamic, fun, and inclusive, but what does that mean? What I like to hear when I ask this question are the stories that are told in response. Such a response may start with something like, sometimes culture is hard to define in words, so I'd rather give you an example of what our culture is like. Then go on to give anecdotes about what happens in your company that best represents the culture. It may be the collaborative nature of teams that come together once every 2 months to work in the community on environment issues, for example. Or it may be the monthly hackathons your team has with their international colleagues where they come together to solve problems. It could be anything, but answer the question with stories rather than the usual adjectives used to describe culture. And put yourself in the shoes of the candidate and speak to yourself as if you're the one in the hot seat being interviewed and wanting to hear why you should be joining this company. Why did you join the company and why are you still here? Just think about that for a second as you're sitting there or standing watching this. Why did you join the company? What was it about the company that made you want to join? Was it the right decision? How could it have been better? How have things changed since you joined, and why do you now stay? Sure, it will be the money, the stability, the benefits, and so on, but what's great about the company that keeps you and others there? This is the kind of thought process and questions you should go through internally to come to the point where you have positive energy and the words to articulate your answers. What frustrates people most about working here, and what's been done about it? Again, this is another question for the internal dialogue. It's a chance to get it all out in the open in your own mind before actually having to share any of it with a candidate. It's a bit like a candidate preparing for the "what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses" question. Sure, you'll want to be honest, but you may not want to share all of the truth for whatever reason. Even if the exercise of thinking this through only helps you better frame some of the challenges that you or your colleagues can impact, then it's a worthwhile exercise. Where would you want to work if it weren't here, and why? This question helps do a couple of things. Firstly, it gets you in the mindset of the candidate who is looking to join your company. Nothing else gets you in the mindset like this, as you're forced to analyse what you love about your competitors or other companies. It may get you thinking about what is important to you in a role in a company, and then cross-referencing these important factors with what exists in your company and what still needs to be changed. The whole process of getting prepared is one that will not only get you ready to sell the role to candidates that you want to hire, but the exercise itself can do so much more. If you're watching this and you're a manager or even more senior, and you're not in HR, you don't have to wait for HR to take the initiative here. Think about these questions, discuss with colleagues, hold workshops, and get the debate going. This is a free and inclusive way to get people at every level of your organisation involved in the pulse of your company. If you already have incredible values and a well-defined culture, that's great, but things can change. What employees need and want can change, but employees wanting to feel valued and involved will remain consistent, so keep this in mind. You can even run an anonymous email campaign for your team or the whole company to get them to answer these questions and analyse the feedback. There's no better way to understand what your team and your colleagues think than to ask them. I don't see it being done enough in companies. You'll know right away if it's been done enough by asking at least 3 people these questions and seeing how different the answers are. If you're like most people watching this, you may acknowledge that these are some good ideas, and you may even stop to think about how you can integrate them into your team. Or at the very least, you may test yourself to see if you have good answers. This is serious though. In my 20 years of recruiting, I've rarely been blown away by a set of answers someone has given me to these questions. Even if I've been impressed by certain individuals, by the time I've asked 2 of their colleagues, it's back to square one. Think about candidates that don't prepare for interviews. We've all interviewed them. Did you ever offer one of them a job or recommend to your colleagues that they deserve a further interview? This is no different. It's unlikely you're going to be asked these questions by a candidate, but you better be sure that if you want to hire someone outstanding, you will need every tool available to land them, and this is just the simple stuff. Just be prepared. One of the main issues I face in working with clients is the actual timeline of the process itself. Clients will often start out saying they need a superstar, and they needed the superstar to start yesterday. Then I agree on a process including X number of interviews with certain people and timelines, and then I get to work. I find a superstar. Sometimes I might find more than one. The client acknowledges they're a superstar. The candidate interviews with the 3 people I've been told they will meet. Then the process goes on hold. Then I find out there are 2 more people that they want them to meet. Then I find out that they're thinking of an internal candidate for the role. And then they change the job spec of the person they're looking for. Things happen and things can change, but not to the extent and with the frequency I've observed in my career working both in-house and as an external supplier. Things really need to tighten up. It's about the candidate experience. That's what matters here. Unless it's a one-person startup, the chances are the company will have hired before. Even if it is a one-person startup, the chances are that one person will have hired for another company before. A recruitment process should never begin until you're ready to finish the process, assuming you get a great candidate through the door. If you're interviewing a truly great candidate, there is always a chance that you won't be the only one. You have to be at least as good as whichever company you're competing with for the candidate. This is the easy stuff. Get organised to run a process from start to finish. Who is part of the interview process? Who has the final say? When a verbal offer is made, who needs to take what action to get the offer letter to the candidate? Is there any way to expedite that process? How long will the process take from start to finish? What are we going to tell candidates to expect from each stage of the process, and how many stages will there be? Can any of the stages be combined and conducted in one day? All of these questions and more should be considered before even going to market to find a candidate. Again, you're competing for talent. If you want the best out there, get the basic easy stuff right first, and not being prepared is not going to cut it. We will go into greater detail on this from an academic research perspective in the science section, where we observe the difference between situational questions and behavioural questions. Situational questions are, for example, we have the scenario at our company, talk me through how you would deal with it. Behavioural questions are those that explore the candidate's past behaviours and experiences with questions like, give me an example of a time when you experienced conflict with one of your team and how you resolved it. The type of memory recall we are referring to here is episodic declarative memories, which are memories of facts and events that have happened in one's life. These are created within the temporal lobe of the brain, but these memories are consolidated and stored in the temporal cortex and elsewhere. This matters because for situational questions and behavioural questions, the interviewer will be accessing different parts of the brain. On the one hand, we have situational questions, which are fundamentally problem-solving questions. And on the other hand, we have behavioural questions, which are almost exclusively memory recall questions. I say almost because those who may want to or need to lie about their memory will no doubt engage in problem-solving to make a story up. Problem-solving occurs in the same area of the brain as creativity. So one could argue that someone with poor memory recall but great problem-solving skills may be able to remember better stories that will position them more favourably to get the job. Neurologically, when given the opportunity to, we grow more in our areas of greater ability. Think for a moment about extremes like child music prodigies who get noticed age 4 playing the piano, and by age 9 they're reciting classical pieces on the piano as if they are a professional adult concert pianist. Or consider physicists who start out being great at math from a young age and grow to work as a professor at one of the great universities of the world. Partly due to genetic inheritance and the uniqueness of our early life, our brains are wired uniquely. Individually, we have areas of our brains that are dense in synaptic connections and neurons, while other areas may be less developed. According to brain science, people grow far more neurons and synaptic connections where they already have the most neurons and synaptic connections. In other words, each brain grows most where it's already strongest. As Joseph Ledoux, a professor of neuroscience at New York University, memorably describes it, added connections are therefore more like new buds on a branch rather than new branches. Through this lens, learning looks a lot like building, little by little, on the unique patterns already there within you. Therefore, someone who happens to be great at memory recall may do very well in an interview, or at least they will recall real memories very well in an interview. That's not to say those recalled memories will be sufficiently impressive to convince the interviewer that they are the best candidate for the role. On the other hand, someone who may have a far more developed creative area of the brain but is just not good at memory recall at all will potentially struggle with such questions. The caveat to this is that the creative person may be able to imagine and describe completely fictitious situations that supposedly occurred in their career. Such a memory may be too old to be challenged by anyone, but too good an answer to discount the candidate from the hiring process. The other issue with memory recall questions is that the memories have to be significant enough to be recalled. Otherwise, they may have been overwritten by other memories, much in the same way you use the same hard drive in your computer to delete and replace information. Per Sederberg, a professor of psychology at Ohio State University, put it quite simply when he said, "A memory of a lifetime is like a big city, with many roads that lead there. We forget memories that are desert towns with only one road in. You want to have a lot of different ways to get to any individual memory. Big events stick in our minds. If you're old enough to remember when the Twin Towers fell, you'll likely recall what you were doing that day. In the work context, you will probably be able to recall your biggest achievement, your biggest disappointment, the greatest boss you ever worked for, and the most stressful situation you've had to deal with at work. However, when such a specific question is asked, such as, recall a time when you had to quickly change project priorities, what steps did you take to initiate change? How do you respond when any such events may be so insignificant in your career that you just can't remember? Behavioural competency questions could equally be renamed the "how good is your memory" part of the interview. On the other hand, with problem-solving questions, where a hypothetical situation is proposed and the candidate is asked how they would deal with that situation, the candidate is, of course, going to try and give the best answer. The best answer may not accurately reflect what they would actually do. Instead, it may be what they believe the interviewer is looking for based on a whole number of factors that lead the candidate to weigh up and guess their answer. Interviewing in nearly all companies I've worked for or studied, many of which are Fortune 500s, is at best described as chaotic guesswork. We've all read about the ridiculous questions that cannot possibly have any measurable outcome, and the justifications for these questions which are, in my view, even more ridiculous. We've already touched upon the over-reliance on competency questions and how they are essentially memory recall questions. What about different people in the interview process asking whatever questions they like and forming opinions largely based on their preconceived ideas? Furthermore, what about interviewers basing their decisions on so many other things than the answers to the questions they ask? The list goes on and on. It's chaotic guesswork. Look online and you'll find no shortage of interview questions to test various aspects of a candidate's experience, performance, and style of engagement. On LinkedIn, there's a special guide with over 100 questions relating to various competencies. On Indeed.com, there are also numerous questions that you can pick out to test different categories. These guides remind me of some of the basic language learning training that give you a whole bunch of questions you can ask, but without any preparation for how the locals may respond in their given dialect and what the response tells you. Imagine yourself walking through the streets of Shanghai as an English-speaking tourist, and you've learned some of the basics all gained from one of those little tourist language guidebooks. You barely learn turn left and turn right, and you've just asked a local for directions to the local bus station, hoping they're going to say in a robotic voice, like they're speaking to a 3-year-old, go straight, turn left, then turn right, bus station. What they actually say is, in their local dialect at high speed, so you want to go to the bus station? I get it. So what you want to do is walk over there to the traffic lights, take a left. About half a mile down the road, you'll see a gas station. When you get there, take your third left and keep walking until you get to a small shoe shop called Comfortable Feet. Just round the corner from there, you'll see the bus stop. They say all of that in Mandarin, and all you can say in return is, thank you. It's just useless having a set of questions when the answers aren't going to help you. For years now, we've been asking the same old questions and getting the same old answers. The degree to which an interview question is relevant, measurable, or susceptible to interviewer bias has rarely been brought into question. People who haven't interviewed before tend to seek advice from HR or peers regarding which questions to ask, and those with many years of experience just know what they're looking for, so have all their favourite questions ready to go anyway. Are these the right questions though? Why do we believe these are the right questions? What do these questions tell us about the candidate and their ability to do a job? How is this answer useful? How can you measure the answers compared to other candidates' answers? Can the answers be objective enough to compare in a meaningful way? Do we even need to be able to compare and measure responses? These are difficult questions, and it's no wonder we haven't sought to tackle them and instead have chosen to revert to the same way we've always done it. If it's not broken, don't fix it, right? Well, to believe it's not broken or acting like it's not broken is not the lens through which to view this problem. What if it could be improved? And what if the candidate experience could also be better? Wouldn't you be curious to find out how? We're going to go on to the solution in part 4, but for now, we need to get to the bottom of what is wrong with these questions that we're asking today. This is a very complicated issue, and it's no surprise we continue to bury our heads in the sand and keep asking what we've always asked. To illustrate the complexity of the issues we're faced with, let me summarise much of what is wrong with the questions that we ask in interviews today. Interviewers aren't questioning what they're asking. If they were, we'd be asking different questions or certainly fewer questions. The answers we get from the questions we're asking cannot be accurately measured or compared in most cases. Sometimes it's not necessary to measure, like when we're looking to build out a story that we can then ask further questions about, for example. However, for the most part, like-for-like comparisons are difficult. For any qualitative answers, the interviewer will often base their opinion on the extent to which they agree with the candidate's opinion. For any quantitative answers, people can lie, and often answers are impossible to fact-check. For competency-based interviews that require memory recall, not everyone can remember every situation they're asked to recall an example about. For competency-based interviews, candidates can lie if they can't think of a real reason. For hypothetical-based interview questions, someone is responding about what they would do in that situation. That's not to say that they would actually do that, and again, they can lie about what they say they would do. Interviews are inevitably biased towards what the interviewer thinks they're looking for. Interviewers are often terrible at interviewing. How are we possibly able to unravel this mess and put it back together in a way that can better predict the outcome of interviews and get us closer to the truth in the first place? It's complicated, right? In part 10, we will look at the science regarding structured and unstructured interviews and how structured interviews win hands down in their ability to lead to more consistent and predictable outcomes. That's not to say the outcomes are reliable and predictable, but they're less unreliable than unstructured interviews. Let me summarise the difference. Structured interviews follow a set structure with predetermined questions, typically asked and scored by more than one person on separate occasions. The theory being that if several different people ask the same questions and score them accordingly, collectively, they will be less biased towards or against the candidate, and the interviewer will be less likely to recruit versions of themselves or people they just happen to like. That bias is not completely eradicated with structured interviews, but it is minimised to a far greater extent than can be achieved by one person asking a bunch of random questions that follow no structure whatsoever. Therefore, it's safe to say that we can focus on structured interviews as the basis for problem identification and also as a basis to solve this problem, which we will do in part 4. Yes, you did read that correctly. I haven't referred to these questions as competency questions because incompetence describes this line of questioning more accurately. According to the dictionary, incompetence is the inability to do something successfully, and competency questions for me fail on so many levels to qualify candidates in an interview, hence why I refer to them here as incompetency questions. I should add that it's not the concept of understanding a candidate's level of competence through asking questions that I take issue with. Rather, it is the traditional behavioural competency-based questions that are the problem. Competence is the ability of an individual to do a job properly. Competencies in the workplace are meant to be a set of defined behaviours that provide a structured guide enabling the identification, evaluation, and development of the behaviours in individual employees. The term competence first appeared in an article authored by R.W. White in 1959 as a concept for performance motivation. Some scholars see competence as a combination of knowledge, skills, and behaviour used to improve performance, or as the state or quality of being adequately or well qualified and having the ability to perform a specific role. For instance, management competency might include emotional intelligence and skills in influence and negotiation. Competency questions, which are also referred to as behavioural questions, are questions that seek to elicit answers about how someone dealt with a particular situation in the past while at work. A popular framework for developing structured behavioural interview questions is the STAR method. STAR stands for situation, task, action, result. The basic premise of this model is situation. What was the situation the candidate was in? A question may begin with, tell me about a time Task. What was the task the candidate needed to accomplish? For example, where you were faced with multiple competing deadlines. Action. What were the actions the candidate took to accomplish this task? For example, what did you do? And result. What were the results of these actions? For example, how did it turn out? Thus, the complete behavioural interview question presented to the candidate would read, tell me about a time when you were faced with multiple competing deadlines, what did you do, and how did it turn out? This STAR method, albeit very popular, is rendered useless by the underlying answers it seeks to find. Ask for examples, sure, but can you give me an example should follow from something they tell you about their experience. Asking for an example of a competency allows for the candidate to pick the best example from any job they've ever done. This does not infer the extent to which that person is generally competent in that regard. For most general competencies, any candidate who has bothered to look up competency interviews will have come up with a few examples anticipating such questions. If asked to demonstrate one competence in one example out of a whole career, what does that tell you about the candidate? That they are abundant in that competence, and that if they've been able to share an example, no matter how weak or insignificant, that they pass that question. It's a ludicrously ineffective way to assess competencies. The issue is that competencies are not normally demonstrated to any reliable degree in just one example. We have to be looking for patterns of competencies rather than just examples of them chosen at random from any stage in their career. Getting a candidate to choose an example from some time in their career is too easy. We also have to make the interviews more engaging and better flowing, focusing on roles one by one, so it's not entirely obvious to the candidates which competencies we're seeking to identify. I'll come on to cover all of this in part 4. But to illustrate, this diagram represents a hypothetical individual's career who's been working for 20 years, and at that point in their career, they're being interviewed for a new role. For the sake of simplicity, their 20-year career has been broken up into 5 different jobs of equal tenure. What job this person does or what companies they work for are of no significance to this illustration. It shows what someone conducting a competency interview may conclude they are observing. The blue area is an abstract representation of the perceived performance of the candidate over their career according to the answers they are receiving to the competency questions. The interviewer picks a competency, they ask for an example, and the candidate gives their best answer. These answers are plotted on the diagram as examples 1, 2, 3, and 4. Their position represents the time in the candidate's career that those examples came from, and the assumed performance of the candidate, as graded by the interviewer based on these examples. What is often happening in competency interviews is that mediocre candidates whose actual performance, illustrated here by the shaded area in this diagram, are able to give amazing examples because despite a mediocre career, they either have one good example of each competency from a whole 20-year period, or they're just good at making things up and therefore give great answers. As the interviewer is skimming through a series of competency-based questions, they're not getting into enough detail of each of the roles in order to spot patterns of competence or lack thereof. Instead, they're forming opinions based on a series of great examples which may not even be real. Worse still, they may be basing their view on a series of bad examples when a good candidate just hasn't been able to remember some of the unmemorable moments the interviewer is inquiring about. Almost anyone in any profession could patch together an amazing history based on the few examples they may have or examples they completely make up. If all the interviewer is doing is targeting specific competencies and not diving deeper into their story with very specific questions, key information will be missed, and worse still, may end up with a misleading story. This problem is further exacerbated by the fact that the interviewer is telling the candidate exactly what competency they're looking to find out about. The candidate then has a chance to assess what they believe the interviewer may be looking to hear and respond accordingly. This differs greatly from asking them a series of questions that guide them deep into each role, where the interviewer is drawing informed conclusions about the presence of certain competencies, or not as the case may be. With competency interviews, there is little to no requirement for real interviewing skills, certainly not as I would define them. I would define real interviewing skills as the ability to direct a candidate through a series of related questions that seeks to form as complete and honest a representation of a candidate's history as one can hope to achieve given inherent interview limitations. The biggest inherent limitation of an interview is that the candidate can lie, of course. Also, it's like meeting a potential partner for an hour and deciding at that very moment if you're willing to spend the next 2 to 5 years with them. Not maybe see them again, but actually make a commitment where you're going to be with them for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, potentially for years. That brings all kinds of pressure and expectations on both sides. The conclusion to this is that if you conduct competency interviews, you just give the candidate the opportunity to dip in and out of their career history at will, choosing the greatest moments or making the moments up. The bottom line is, candidates have one history and one story. To get the best from candidates and to give them the best opportunity to present themselves fully and fairly, you have to get very deep and specific about each role. It helps them remember through the association of facts, and it will help the interviewer to spot trait patterns and reach a more informed conclusion about their candidacy. We will revisit this when reviewing the solution in Part 4. To give you a sense of how bad this behavioural interview epidemic is, here are some guidelines taken directly from the Society for Human Resource Management, SHRM, the largest membership organisation of its kind in the world, with a reported 300,000 members in 165 countries. For competency-based questions, they suggest having a 5-point Likert scale, with a definition of each number being broadly described here. 5. Far exceeds requirements. Perfect answer. Demonstrates competency accurately, consistently, and independently. All points were relevant, all good examples. 4. Exceeds requirements. Demonstrates competency accurately and consistently in most situations with minimal guidance, many good examples. 3. Meets requirements. Demonstrates competency accurately and consistently on familiar procedures and needs supervisor guidance for new skills. Some good examples. 2. Below requirements. Demonstrates competency inconsistently, even with repeated instruction or guidance. Few good examples. 1. Significant gap. Fails to demonstrate competency regardless of any guidance provided. No good examples. Here are 4 examples of their questions, along with some commentary on why I find them to be falling short of being fit for purpose. 1. Describe a time when you needed to work as part of a team on a project or initiative. What was your role in the team, and what actions did you take to contribute to the team in that role? Rating scale. Candidate's response indicates that in a similar situation, he or she could be expected to 1. To fail to offer the information about his or her part in the team. 3. To offer advice on various pieces of the project or initiative. 5. To discuss contributions with the team and come to a consensus on the best approach to meet all needs. As previously mentioned, one of the problems with nearly all competency questions for me is that they're too specific. Sure, being specific about experience is a good thing, but only when there's a journey in the conversation from the big picture to the specific question. The issue with this and nearly all competency questions, as we've come to understand them, is that they are part of a battery of questions that suffocates the interview format of any conversational direction that would make life for everyone involved a little bit more interesting and productive. With this question, the interviewer is assessing the candidate's ability to work in a team or lead a team, and they're asking the candidate to pick one example. So based on this one example, is the interviewer expected to conclude that this is how that person works in teams in general? They may have 10, 20 or 30 years experience. Getting this granular is just a complete miss with regards to the bigger picture. The worst thing about this question is the definitions in the rating scale. It's so prescriptive that someone can either get a 1 for failing to offer information at all, to a 5 which states to discuss contributions with the team and comes to a consensus on the best approach to meet all needs. Well, what if their role in the team was not to reach a consensus but to lead and drive change? Or something that didn't require reaching a consensus? What if their role in the team wasn't a leader and the leader had a particularly autocratic leadership style, which is part of the reason the candidate is looking to move? Do they fail this question because they weren't allowed to make much of a contribution to the team discussion? Are they no longer considered a good team player because their answer wasn't sufficient enough? How could this question be better posed? Well, it all depends on the context, the seniority of the candidate, the role they're interviewing for, and the roles they've been doing. That's another reason why these specific behavioural questions don't work. If you're going to design a set of interview questions that will be reused across many different roles and that covers broad terms like team contribution, the questions have to start more widely. In part 4, we'll come on to look at how you get better results with a more engaging interview process by breaking it down into facts and stories with a model that favours competence over experience. The short answer is, rather than asking about one example and making an assessment on that basis, the interviewer should be asking general questions about each role. Then they should go deeper with other questions that help to identify patterns of behaviour, not just single instances. Number 2, give an example of a time when you had to change project priorities quickly. What steps did you take to initiate change? Rating scale. Candidate's response indicates that in a similar situation, he or she could be expected 1. To be too busy to initiate change. 3. To change what he or she was doing to address the immediate need. 5. To seek out relevant stakeholders to assist in change initiation and priority order. I assume this question aims to seek out information about how someone initiates change, how responsive they are, and how they mobilise other people in the organisation to impact change. One can assume from the rating scale that if, according to this prescriptive model, the candidate tells a story about how they sought out relevant stakeholders to assist in change initiation, that they've done really well. What if the candidate is describing a situation where it sounds like the change in priorities was initiated because the original priorities were due to poor judgment on their part? Does the interviewer score them 5 because they were correct to shift their priorities, even although it was from previously miscalculated priorities on their part? This is what I mean about the questions being too specific. They're so specific that the answers may satisfy the rating scale, but they don't paint a fair picture, for good or bad, about the underlying competence they're trying to assess. Question 3. Think of a time when you had to build credibility with stakeholders. What actions did you take? Rating scale. Candidate's response indicates that in a similar situation, he or she could be expected 1. To fail to take action. 3. To answer stakeholder questions and provide background information. 5. To identify and assist in implementing solutions to help the organisation become more effective. The underlying question is, how do you build credibility with stakeholders? How an interviewee scores top marks here is by showing that in a similar situation, they could be expected to identify and assist in implementing solutions to help organisations become more effective. Really? What is the difference between scoring a 3 and scoring a 5 here? By the looks of the grading system, the difference is influence. If they score a 3, they simply develop their credibility to the point where the stakeholders will listen to what they have to say. Whereas with a 5, they'll be allowed to help in implementing solutions. What's worse, failing to take action, 1, or taking action that is clearly so bad that it's not acted upon, 3? One could argue the latter is worse. At least the person who scored a 1 knew just to stay quiet. Because they stayed quiet, does that mean they will fail the test for building stakeholder credibility? Question 4. Think about a time when you have encountered an ineffective process or transaction. What steps did you take following this discovery? Rating scale. Candidate's response indicates that in a similar situation, he or she could be expected to 1. Ignore the problem. 3. To analyse the process internally. 5. To investigate and make recommendations based on industry standards. I assume this question touches upon integrity and initiative. This is one of those questions that is so specific, yet the incident could have been so insignificant that it may just not be remembered. As previously mentioned, stronger memories form deeper neural pathways and thus can be remembered more readily than those memories that get overwritten by other, newer memories due to lack of disk space. What if the memory was so insignificant that the interviewee simply couldn't recall? Will the candidate be marked down even although all the experience and growth, as evidenced by the resume and stories they've been sharing, tell you they hold integrity in the highest regard and readily demonstrate taking initiative? In these examples, I didn't even touch on the fact that people can lie and make up stories to suit the question. Some may think, well, they can follow up with references and find out from other people. Really? You're going to fact check all the answers to 50 different questions, some of which ask about experiences recalled from 10 years ago when a minor conflict was resolved because of their actions. Do you think their boss is going to recall those instances? Besides, it doesn't matter. The point is, this is a super inefficient, flawed, and frankly a dull way to interview people. These examples are from the largest HR membership organisation in the world. And this is not a point to ridicule SHRM, but rather it best represents the fact that we continue to do what we've always done and aren't asking enough questions about the questions we're asking. In my opinion, the all-time worst interview questions are, what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses? These questions are still being asked. What does the interviewer do with the answers they are given to these questions? Do they collate them and compare the lies people put forward as their weaknesses to see who has the most manageable weaknesses? Are they scored based on merit and imagination? How do they discern a candidate's ability to do a job by asking such a question? What do they hope to do with the candidate's weaknesses? How do they grade the extent to which a weakness will be an insurmountable challenge in comparison to someone else's weakness? Can they even rely on a candidate to tell them where they fall short? Have you, as an interviewer, ever stopped and thought about these questions in any depth? All too often, all we get is trained answer that has no impact on the process. Our interviewers expect them to hear the truth like, oh, my weakness is getting up in the morning. That's why I was fired and I lost control the amount of times I didn't wake up before 11 a.m. But my strength is recognizing my weakness, although I'd probably say another weakness is not taking action to remedy my weaknesses. This would be something I'd work on if I was hired, but until I am, I'm determined not to do anything about it. Oh, that's another strength, determination. Can I use that one instead? I'm determined to overcome my weaknesses after I start work. There you go. Good, right? Are the answers given to such questions going to be a pass or a fail? What are the criteria for passing and failing? Your own opinion as to what is a good strength and a bad weakness? Or maybe how good or bad you believe their answer is compared to other candidates? This does nothing to qualify a candidate in or out. Sure, those who fail may not be put forward, but people at mid to senior level don't typically fail such questions. These are interview questions that if someone is taking any time at all to prepare for the interview, they will have practiced their answers and be ready for them. One of the problems is that the candidate is asked to provide an answer to a question that the interviewer cannot fact check. So what is the best answer to give? What is the interviewer looking to hear? I've had personal experience of this with a partner from a global investment bank who was a global HR divisional leader who asked these questions in the 7th round of a 13-round interview process. She actually asked, so what are your strengths and tell me a bit about your weaknesses. When I heard this, I just thought, here is someone who is almost certainly earning $1 million or more per year, tasked with running the people organization of part of an investment bank, and they're taking the time out their busy day to interview a candidate, and this is all they've got. I would have hoped to have been more inspired by such a senior person, a leader in the industry of HR, who I would have assumed would be asking some very challenging questions. This is just one example. Some people who believe these are good questions will probably say something along the lines of, it tests their self-awareness and brings to light areas they can improve, and it allows them to share their plan of action to combat their weaknesses. Or they may say, in highlighting their weaknesses, we can put together a personal development plan for those that have great strengths but just have 1 or 2 areas for development. I don't believe for a moment that this is the best test for self-awareness, or that this question is simply being asked to put together a great development plan. It's asked because they haven't thought through the whole interview. And these are the questions that they've always asked, and the team is great, so we must be doing something right. Well, what if you can be doing better? How does that conversation even go when they give you the perfect answer? The candidate says, I'm really good at leadership and winning the hearts and minds of people and driving change that leads to better productivity and customer service. My weakness is I'm really disorganized, but I have a fantastic secretary that keeps me right. What does the interviewer even do with this information? Run to their colleague after the interview, all excited and say, Claire, listen, you're not going to believe this. I found the perfect candidate. We were looking for a change agent who could really change up the team and deliver better customer service. Well, he said almost these words. He even said change. Can you believe it? He's our guy, and guess what? His only weakness is that he's disorganized. Jane is a fantastic assistant. She can totally take care of him, so why don't we get an offer out to him? Now, I can't imagine this has ever happened, but this is how silly these questions are, in my opinion. Please, no more strengths and weaknesses questions. But what else are we going to ask? Well, we'll come on to this in part 4. I remember many years ago when I worked for a recruiting company, I was asked to get involved in recruiting recruiters for our team. My boss would come out of the interview room, call me over, and often say something like, "I really like this guy. Have a chat with him and see what you think." So first of all, I already know that he really liked him. How am I now meant to undertake an interview with a candidate that I know is being favoured by my boss? Is it my role to come back to him and confirm I also like him so as not to upset my boss? Or is it the case that my boss is testing me and wants to hear what I really think? I always assumed it was the former, which is not a great position to be in, as I either have to like the candidate and agree, or probably, just to be safe, dislike the candidate yet still agree. In the end, I would always give an honest opinion. Either way, there was never any formalised way to evaluate. It was just, see if you like the guy. What does that even mean? Do I interpret what that means based on my understanding of the word like? Do I assume he means that I should assess whether he'll be a good culture fit, whether he's an ethical recruiter, or whether he's a very high-performing recruiter, or a combination of all of these? From my experience of working with Fortune 500 companies, it is certainly more structured than it was back in my early days. Nevertheless, a lot of these structure seems to be for structure's sake itself, rather than any well-considered, purposeful process where questions have been well thought through and objective opinions can be compared on a fair basis. Anyone responsible for interviewing in any capacity really only needs to sit down and think through their process, if there is one, and for each question they typically use, ask, why am I asking this? Is there a better question to ask? What am I going to do with the answers that I'm given? How am I going to compare these answers to the answers I get from other candidates? If you can do so in a truly objective way, you may find yourself doing some interview question spring cleaning. Beyond the limitation of interviewers and the traditional competency-based approach to questions, there is another issue to consider. What may appear to be poor or wrong answers may not always be the smoking gun that you were looking for. For example, if someone is honest enough to tell you that they were once fired, what does that actually tell you? That they are susceptible to getting fired and should be overlooked for any role moving forward? Don't be so quick to judge. Steve Jobs was fired from Apple in 1985, only to start another company that was eventually bought by Apple, and he ended up back in the driving seat in 1997. He sold a large amount of stock in 1997, so much so that Apple's price dropped by 12%, and he convinced the board to fire the then CEO and then to hire him into that position. Jamie Dimon, who's been the CEO of JP Morgan since 2005, was fired from his job at Citi by the chairman and CEO at the time, Sandy Weill. In an interview with the New York Times in 2010, Sandy's reported to have said that he fired Jamie because he was too ambitious and he wanted the CEO role, but Sandy wasn't ready to step down. In 2019, Steve Easterbrook, the CEO of McDonald's at the time, was fired for breaking company rules by having a relationship with another member of staff. In his 4-year tenure, McDonald's stock price doubled. Does that mean he'll never work again or should not be selected for any future leadership role? He broke the rules, granted, but he will no doubt learn from this lesson. The point is, even when we get the answers we may have been looking for but perhaps didn't want to hear, we can't just take every small detail and warp it into a negative viewpoint. In situations like these, the context and bigger picture must be considered. This is why it truly is a skill to interview someone. First of all, you have to get beyond the lies and the half-truths, but then you need to know what to do with the information when you get it, because it's just not as straightforward as putting a black mark against their name. It has to be viewed with perspective and the bigger picture. Otherwise, great candidates may fall through the cracks. In an interview with Y Incubator, the very successful startup accelerator investment company, Mark Zuckerberg was asked, "How do you assess someone's raw talent?" His response? "I think what's important is not to believe that someone has to have specifically done the job they're going to do in order to do it well. Throughout my career, I've often heard from interviewers that a candidate didn't have the right experience. Most often that's perfectly valid feedback, but it really depends on the context. You can't hire a theatre nurse to do heart surgery any more than you can hire a burger flipper at McDonald's to work in a Michelin star restaurant, certainly not without a significant amount of training. This would be technical training though. However, when it comes to leadership or management roles, while experience in leading or managing is important, the product or service that the company provides is less important. I've had first-hand experience of a client in a global bank specifically wanting to hire someone with no banking experience. This was a supply chain finance leadership role, and what the person does is less relevant, but needless to say, they wanted someone to come from the client side, outside of banking, who truly understood the client, and it turned out to be a great strategy for them. Another example, again in banking, but this time in technology, not a hire I had anything to do with, but one of the big investment banks hired a CIO from the aerospace industry. She had no banking experience, but she was a highly competent leader. There is a valid argument for hiring people without experience but with competence in certain cases. The clearest example of this is in hiring graduates. Usually they have no experience in the relevant field, aside from perhaps an internship, yet they get hired for their competence, intelligence, and also how they've performed in their life to date. High-performing individuals are high-performing individuals. If people can demonstrate intelligence both emotionally and intellectually, with patterns of competence being evident, and if they can demonstrate that they're a high-performing individual in many other ways, experience becomes less of a necessity. This also feeds in well to the need to hire a diverse slate of candidates. People with different experiences can often bring a new approach or different viewpoints on things. Of course, from a technical perspective, you cannot hire, for example, somebody with only Python coding experience to code in a completely different language. But we're not discussing the technical aspects of roles here. This is leadership or management hiring. Roles that require people to come in, formulate a strategy, get the right people on board, execute, and deliver on goals. People bringing fresh ideas to the table with different backgrounds can add tremendous value and shouldn't always be overlooked in favour of experience. Furthermore, someone can have experience in a particular role, but that doesn't always make them better than someone with no experience in that particular role. Someone who is sufficiently intelligent and competent can do very well in a role where that person has no experience. We see this with entrepreneurs all the time. Look at Mark Zuckerberg. Would anyone in the world have hired him while he was still at Harvard to become the CEO of a social media company? No way. But he's smart and competent, and it's an understatement to say he succeeded in that role. Someone who has lots of experience in a particular role with outstanding performance didn't get there without being intelligent and competent. So we have to keep an open mind when hiring new managers and leaders. Experience doesn't always equate to performance, and not least because someone who has done the exact role before may not be as motivated as much as someone who may see it as a fresh challenge. The suggestion here is not to go out and hire somebody who's been running a chocolate factory to be a regional director of a luxury clothing brand, but rather industries where there may be broader synergies. Someone who's been a regional director for a luxury watch brand, for example, could make a great director for a clothing brand. Their customers are very similar, it's retail, the team dynamics are the same, and the overall structure of the business with the supply chain and so on will be very similar. In this instance, we need to keep an open mind and not discount a luxury watch director because they don't have fashion experience. Bringing experience from related industries but with different products potentially gives the candidate a significant enough career change for it to be exciting again, without it being so different that the candidate and the hiring company are at risk. If you're the final decision maker in an interview process, it goes without saying that you will have a degree of influence over others during the process. A key mistake made here in the interview process is having debriefs after each interview. Of course, you have to be able to share some opinions, as otherwise several different people will be interviewing terrible candidates when they could have been excluded from the process after the first interview. That communication should only really be, I think we should progress this candidate to the next phase, or not as the case may be. Any discussion about why they're great or what was on their scorecard is only going to influence any future interviewer for good or bad. Also, you may want to communicate with other interviewers areas of questioning that you would like them to pursue if you spotted something that requires further investigation or a second opinion. However, it is the sharing of scorecards and deep details about ratings during the process that does not help minimize candidate bias or maximize a productive candidate discussion and debrief. In Part 4, I will introduce a process that is designed to minimize unnecessary influencing, where scorecards are submitted as close to anonymously as the hiring process allows, so a final report is created ready to share with the key decision makers who will be responsible for making or signing off on the hire. It may be a stretch to refer to reference checks as one of the 7 problems. You should be doing background checking and reference checking, but this is more of a cautionary note. For me, taking references is a bit like thinking of marrying someone and then getting that person's ex to give a reference to help you decide whether you're going to marry them or not. What if their ex left them and it wasn't their decision or choice for the partner to leave? What if their ex-partner had been the most amazing partner to them, but because of their decision to move on, the ex turned sour and couldn't utter a positive word about them even if they were paid to? On the other hand, what if they're still the best of friends and get on well, but the potential new partner was just too unhinged for the ex to see a lifelong romantic future together? Perhaps the ex couldn't deal with them anymore, but wanted them to be happy, so the ex gave a good reference. Many years ago, while recruiting in Canada, I was given some advice that when interviewing, I should ask for the names of every manager, and importantly, I should get them to spell the name. Asking them to spell the name was supposed to strike the fear of God into the candidate, so they would feel obliged to tell the truth, as they knew it was going to come out anyway when the interviewer would follow up and call the referees. At the time, I just thought, this is the kind of transparent amateur approach that would work on 5-year-old kids when you tell them they have to be honest because if they don't, the mattress monsters are going to bite them in their sleep. I don't do that, by the way. Besides, even if the interviewer does follow through and call all the references, let's think for a moment about how that process will go. Assumingly in this scenario, the candidate gives the interviewer the name of their previous bosses, and perhaps the interviewer even asks to set up the call. If I'm the candidate, I'm immediately going to email all the referees with something like, "Hey John, long time no speak. In checking your LinkedIn profile, it seems you're doing great, so congratulations on your progress there. I'm currently in the running for this great new role, and they'd like to follow up on references with all my old bosses. Sarah Davies is going to be calling you sometime on Thursday, so I just wanted to give you the heads up. It'll be great if we can connect before the call, but in case you don't have time, to jog your memory, all they know from me is that I was the sales director there, that I had a team of 20 people when I joined, 30 when I left, and that I grew the revenues by 180% in my 3 years there. I'm not even sure if they will ask anything else, but I really want this role, so I'd appreciate any positive words you may have to say. Best regards, Gavin." The whole process of setting up reference calls and having the chance to prep referees invalidates the whole interview process, or certainly the reference checking part of it. The chances are it's going to provide nothing meaningful to the process. I certainly know that when I get calls to reference people that have worked for me over the years, I never give a bad reference. To be fair, I've never had someone work for me who got fired for stealing or any criminal activity, so I haven't had to contemplate such a situation. However, I've certainly had people working for me who I fired or who weren't up to par. For the most part, people who have worked for me in the past have either been great and we get on well, and I wish them well, or they didn't do so well and it didn't work out, but I still wish them well and want them to succeed in life. Also, there are situations in life that affect people and their performance. Someone close to an employee could die, or perhaps they could be going through a terrible divorce which renders them partially useless in the workplace for an undefined period. So with references, of course you have to follow them up, and of course you want to find out as much information as possible. However, references are just another opinion about how someone has done in their career. Furthermore, that opinion may be heavily influenced by the extent to which the referee had a positive working relationship with the candidate, or not, as the case may be. If someone has been an absolute rock star their whole career, but one referee gives a bad reference from a few years back because they didn't get on so well, what are you going to do with that information? Pass on the candidate because Johnny McSomeone said he didn't think he'd be good at the role? Sure, investigate further, but just as we look for patterns of success through the Bremis method of interviewing, rather than single instance competency questions, it should be patterns of negativity rather than single instances that warrant a pass on a candidate, except in exceptional circumstances. In my experience, the most useful references have come from people who've worked with the candidate in the past, with the reference being sourced confidentially through people in my network. It is certainly the case that opinions of referees handpicked by the candidate should be considered with as much credibility as a 4-year-old's response to the question about when quantum computing will render binary encryption useless. With a properly constructed interview process, with built-in fact-checking and cross-referencing, and with observations about significant patterns of success and progress being noted, references should be weighed up accordingly and with a degree of caution. With all of the issues, the interviewer, the structure, the questions, how we judge the answers, whether experience is even important, influencing others during the process, and reference checking, it is clear there's a lot of work we have to do to improve the whole interview process and experience. It is also clear that it's just a very complicated set of problems. In my observations of working with many different companies over the past 20 years, I believe we tend to overthink the process and over-interview. I believe this happens because we don't fundamentally trust the process, and deep down we kind of know that we don't really have a good grip on how this process should work. If we did, we wouldn't keep hearing about all these bizarre questions, and we certainly wouldn't just continually rely on the very shallow and useless competency-based questions that typically form part of the HR interview in larger companies. Ultimately, interviewing is a process to try and learn as much about a candidate in a short space of time, seeking to predict how well they may do compared to other candidates for a given role. I don't think we have to make it as complicated as we have been, and for sure we need to be stopping, taking a step back, and asking a series of questions about our interview process. Are the hiring managers trained to interview people in terms of selling the company, the role, and qualifying candidates based on pre-agreed criteria? Are the questions we're asking fit for purpose? And if so, what purpose do they serve? Does our interview process have mechanisms in place to minimize the potential for candidates lying and for hiring managers to make as unbiased decisions as one possibly can, given the inherent limitations? Is the candidate experience going to be optimized by the structure of our interview process? I haven't had an opportunity to analyze all Fortune 500 companies and others, but I'm relatively certain that all companies will fail in answering one or more of these questions. I strongly believe they'll all fail in answering the first question. If you think your company is the exception, try asking your colleagues some of the questions outlined at the beginning of the section and see if you're happy with the answers. If you're not, don't worry, as the remaining sections will help in giving you some structure to get closer to the perfect interview process, or at least a version of one that is closer than you may be today.